3 weeks ago, we discussed this painting in the British Art Centre, The Death of Lucretia by the Scottish artist Gavin Hamilton, a real milestone of neoclassical high drama and pathos. Life-size figures just charged with moral fervor. The picture we're going to talk about today hangs about 10 steps away. It's also full of fervor, and it's ambitious, but in very different ways. It's also much smaller. It's only about 4 feet wide. Let's just look at it for a bit. The picture shows the palace of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, and it's the climactic episode in his life. For that episode, I'm going to read you what its first audience in 1821 was able to read, part of the Old Testament book of Daniel in the King James Version, excerpted in a brochure written by the organizer of an exhibition, no doubt in collaboration with the artist, that was sold to visitors to the painting. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink therein. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. And in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one another against one another. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king said, "Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet, and shall have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then said the queen, "There's a man named Daniel, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father made master of the musicians and the astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation." Then was Daniel called to interpret the handwriting on the wall. And this was the interpretation thereof: Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Upharsin, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. In that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain. The episode took place while the Israelites were captives in Babylon. The story is about pride that goes before a fall, the sinful pride of the Babylonian kings. Belshazzar's predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, had not only taken the Jews captive and led them back to Babylon, but he had also looted the temple of Jerusalem and took the sacred vessels as booty. Not just the vessels here, but as you see in Martin's interpretation anyway, a menorah as well. Belshazzar compounds the sin. He has the vessels brought in, and he and his courtiers eat and drink from them. An act of brazen blasphemy. The Israelite prophet Daniel, who's the author and the hero of the story, writes that he was summoned to interpret the words of God that foretell the destruction of the king and his empire. Martin conceives the palace in Babylon as an immense colonnaded courtyard, and beyond, past three massive corbelled arches, another vast hall with long tables. Above and beyond this, there are more terraced buildings and a stepped tower, a ziggurat. Next to it is an even bigger round tower, the Tower of Babel. And the hanging gardens are up there too, in the dark on the right. At the left, there's a storm with lightning and clouds swirling around the towers. Hanging in the sky are the moon and a planet in conjunction, all signaling an important event. Everybody's reacting to that fiery message on the wall or to Daniel's prophecy. The pamphlet I mentioned, sold to visitors, describes Belshazzar. The astonishment of the king is powerfully wrought upon the interesting but supercilious features of his face. Horror seems to be blended there with a strong sense of anger and spiteful perverseness. The huge gold throne is prophetically empty. In the foreground, bearded men in long robes point towards the bright light, acting astonished. Several of them have a huge scroll with which they're trying to understand the meaning of the Hebrew words, but they're failing. No one can hide from the light. You see the general panic in the courtyard, hundreds of ant-sized figures, some of whom at the far right here of this slide are making burnt offerings to the colossal gilded statue of a man in armor wrapped in a snake. This is Marduk, the chief Babylonian deity. In the middle, the head table is set with tremendous gold and silver vessels from Jerusalem. But dinner has been interrupted before it began. People make prayerful gestures and listen to Daniel. The pamphlet says about Daniel, a captive on the banks of the Euphrates, he lived secluded from society and yet well known to the Babylonian court. He's represented here, most properly, as a man stricken in years with that sullen appearance which never leaves entirely the countenance of an exile. He is the principal character in the drama, the pamphlet goes on, the group of which he is the prominent figure. Assuming the pyramidal form now, he becomes the focus of interest, and in a pictorial point of view, this part of the performance obtains all the effect which the artist could ever have anticipated in the warmest hope of his enthusiastic mind. Well, who was John Martin exactly, the man with the enthusiastic mind, and why a special pamphlet to explain and praise his picture? Belshazzar's feast was a huge success with the public, and not just right away in 1821, but for many years afterward. Martin brought to life a moment of high drama from a famous biblical story and invented a thrilling setting for it, both grandiose and minutely detailed, and added special effects. I will come back to Martin's career, but for now I just want to stay with the painting for a few minutes and its role in the history of narrative painting and of visual spectacle. Martin painted a larger version first of this composition and exhibited it at the British Institution in 1821. It attracted so many visitors that barriers were put up in front of it, and it was decided to extend the run of the show a couple of weeks. One critic called the picture glorious, and another said that Martin should be elected to the Royal Academy forthwith. The directors of the Institute awarded Martin a prize of £200, they could afford it, since they had netted an extra £1,000 from the additional admission fees that the Belshazzar brought in, and the sale of pamphlets. Artists who wrote about the picture had mixed opinions. Most of them felt some combination of admiration and resistance. For example, C.R. Leslie wrote, "It has made more noise among the masses than any picture that has been exhibited since I've been here." The artists, however, and connoisseurs did not like it much. Like other pictures in the show, the Belshazzar was for sale, and it sold for a stiff offering price of £800 to one William Collins, who had plans for it. As soon as the show was over, Collins took it to his premises in the Strand, and he put it on exhibition together with another Old Testament picture by Martin that had been a big hit a few years earlier, Joshua commanding the sun to stand still. Then Collins sent the pictures to Scotland in 1822 with a claim that it had already been seen by 100,000 people. And after that, the tour began in earnest, to Leeds, to Liverpool, Dublin, back to Edinburgh and Glasgow, to Bristol, and pretty much every major city in the British Isles. That pamphlet ended up going through 45 editions. Attendance for the first 4 years was heavy because of the hype and the word of mouth, and a few years later it got a boost from the sale of reproductions when Martin published this large mezzotint engraving. Collins was not well pleased. He tried to sue the painter for breach of rights as an owner, but Martin hadn't actually used Collins's large version. Instead, he'd used one of the two smaller versions that he'd painted with reproduction in mind, the one now at Yale that we've been looking at, and the other one at Hartford, both very accurate. Martin had learned how to make magnificent engravings using steel plates, a brand new technology, plates that were durable and guaranteed that many, many hundreds of prints could be pulled from them without much loss of quality. The tour of Belshazzar's feast and the print were only the beginning of the commercial life of the picture. Martin made a second plate and sold 400 more prints. Then it passed to a printmaker who was still printing it and selling it even after Martin's death in 1854. We know of 3 other authorized versions, and then there are a lot of clumsy rip-offs like this one at the top. And there were other versions that are interesting from the viewpoint of new kinds of entertainment and mass media. I just want to say a few words about 18th century, what we now call new media, that were big attractions in London. One of them on the top is the Ido Fusikon by the painter Philip de Loutherbourg, which opened in Leicester Square in 1781. You paid your entry fee, and you saw what were billed as moving pictures representing phenomena of nature, such as storms at sea. Well, what was moving were parts of the scene, various cut-out flat pieces with waves and ships and so forth, moving up and down or back and forth, and the lights were changing all the time. Below is the famous Ido Metropolis of 1802 by Thomas Girton. These impresarios were very good at naming things and inventing them with impressive titles for them. Greek names were the sign particularly of science at work, even though Ido Fusikon simply meant image of nature. The one at the bottom here, the Ido Metropolis, was a panorama, 100 feet long plus, a 360-degree view of London as you paid to get in. It surrounded you when you got in the middle as you looked at it and turned around. It's been destroyed, like the Ido Fusikon, but some of Girton's studies survive, and that's what we're looking at on the screen. Painted panoramas like this multiplied all over Europe and America in the 19th century. John Martin seems to have been eager for the chance to have his pictures entertain audiences of a kind that wouldn't have come to the Royal Academy. A large painted copy of his Belshazzar's Feast was shown starting in 1833 in a diorama in the Queen's Bazaar in Oxford Street. A diorama being an even newer kind of visual entertainment where a translucent painting was shown over here. You sat at the right over here under a kind of tent looking towards the picture, while lights were manipulated to make the image change and seem to move as you watched. Dioramas had been popular since 1823, when the first one was built in Paris by Louis Daguerre, the stage designer and painter, and later inventor of photography. You note the man here in the upper right cranking away. This is the diorama built in London in the same year. In the Queen's Bazaar, Belshazzar's Feast was shown in a double feature with another image billed as York Minster on Fire. One object is preserved that gives some idea of the visual sensation that the translucent picture Belshazzar's Feast produced. This painting in the upper left on glass by the specialist duo of Hoadley and Oldfield. They made at least 4 more copies of various Martin paintings. The papers announced the news that one of these glass paintings had been bought by the Duke of Northumberland and another by an unnamed American. Speaking of Americans, all sorts of other versions of the Belshazzar were shown in this country, including one at a diorama on North Street in Manhattan. And engravings of it were sold here in large quantities for many years, the most common being the color print issued by the Leighton brothers just after the Civil War. You can find them in guest rooms and closets still all over New England. You might check. These exhibitions in Britain used marketing techniques taken over from touring theater companies, paid ads in the newspapers, planted stories announcing the imminent opening, the dates and hours and admission fees and so on. And then as the closing day approached, more ads with breathless warnings of the last chance to see these sensational masterpieces. It's the whole battery of familiar museum publicity techniques. The Bradford poster reminds us that John Martin is, as you see, the painter of Belshazzar's Feast. And also that these are the most sublime and extraordinary pictures in the world, valued at 8,000 guineas, and that they're 13 by 10 feet, and that they've been inspected by upwards of 2 million persons. The exhibitions were open at night, thanks to gaslight, which began as street lighting. This is Pall Mall on the upper left. And it recently moved indoors and was now in theaters and other public places. Gaslight was hard and bright, and it must have made Martin's pictures look even more vivid and stagey than they had in daylight or candlelight. More important, night openings meant that workers could come, not just people of leisure, and come they did. Well, having given you an idea of the phenomenal success of Belshazzar's Feast and something of its show business context, I need to introduce John Martin. A critic in 1834 who gave Martin's work a bad review wrote that he was, and I'm quoting him, the most universally popular painter of the day. He had a lot in common with Edward Bulwer Lytton, his younger contemporary, the author of The Last Days of Pompeii and other best-selling books of historical fiction. Bulwer Lytton knew Martin, and he wrote that he was the greatest, most lofty, most original genius of his age. Martin's rise to fame is another 19th century fable of ambition, of hard work and social mobility. Unlike Bulwer Lytton, who was well-born and educated at Cambridge, Martin was born in poverty in a cottage in Northumberland, in the industrial north, near Newcastle and the Scottish border. Martin got very little formal education, and he was sent to work for a coach painter and got his instruction at drawing on the side, and then moved to London in 1806 to eke out a living working for a porcelain maker, painting mainly landscape decorations and teaching drawing on the side. Nothing had prepared the London audience for the first painting that Martin showed at the Royal Academy exhibition of 1812 under the title Sadak, in Search of the Waters of Oblivion, an exotic subject treated in a suitably extravagant style. The hero Sadak is sent by the Sultan to find and bring back the so-called waters of oblivion that the Sultan says will get Sadak's wife out of prison. And there's the lone hero clinging to a rock shelf and pulling himself up, needing to cross this lake to the burning mountain where the waters are to be had. This painting's 6 feet high, of a tiny figure in a loincloth on a fantastic errand, struggling upward in a hot, jagged, hostile world, evidently made a very big impression on the audience. One reviewer wrote that the artist communicates with no small portion of his energy the romantic ideas of its author. The subject would afford a sublime treat from the hand of Mr. Turner. Turner had already actually shown the way for Martin. Turner was 14 years older, and he'd made a great success by the time Martin came to London. He'd shown this picture in the Royal Academy exhibition of 1800, the fifth plague of Egypt, which was the epidemic sent by Yahweh that killed all the Pharaoh's animals, with a fanciful Egyptian or Egyptoid city, mountains, and a roiling sky thick with impending doom. This was Turner's first full-blown romantic subject, and Turner could learn from it. Martin also learned from Turner's example how to make a living from engraved reproductions of his pictures. In fact, these beautiful mezzotints after Turner, like the one on the right, were by Martin's older brother, Charles, who made this his business. In the same year that Martin showed his Sadak, Turner sent this to the Royal Academy, an even more turbulent and hostile setting for a story of heroic persistence by Hannibal. Turner set the precedent for this kind of hair-raising historical showpiece, and his success created a niche for Martin as a painter and a printmaker. I should point out that Turner was not either painting from pure feeling or from pure observation. I mean, like every artist, he had inherited a whole storehouse of images and ideas from earlier art, and he would have been very glad to acknowledge where this taste for remote and dangerous places came from, places like the stormy Alps. It came in good part from pictures, ultimately from landscapes by Salvator Rosa of the 17th century, showing inhospitable places with jagged rocks, broken trees, rushing water, storm-laden clouds, populated by solitary types like hermits doing penance and bandits hiding their swag in caves. Around 1700, writers started to use a term borrowed from classical rhetoric, sublime, to describe this kind of landscape and the feelings of awe and even fear that you might experience in looking at them. By sublime, they were often referring to the Alps and other rugged places far from civilization, where you could have sensations very different from the calm comfort that they got from bucolic landscapes, which they distinguished as beautiful. You could find the sublime at home. A few of Martin's contemporaries were drawn to places of really frightening grandeur in Britain and made paintings of vast size to overwhelm the viewer. This is a place in the North Yorkshire Dales called Gordale's Scar. And the painting is about 11 feet high, painted by James Ward, just about the time of Martin's Arabian Nights fantasy of Sadak, with a similar kind of boiling clouds and ominous tone. These distinctions, sublime and beautiful, had been explored 50 years earlier by Edmund Burke, who saw them, sublime and beautiful, as opposites, as antithetical. It is very definitely the sublime that John Martin strives for, not only the extremes in nature, but also the extremes of human aspiration. Martin's next triumph was this large painting that you saw for a moment earlier, Joshua commanding the sun to stand still upon Gibeon. A reviewer wrote about this, "A more astonishing picture for magnitude of design and for detail we never saw." Another said it was truly historical and poetical, an accumulation of the grand in nature and art. Well, where in Turner's picture Hannibal and his men overcame an alpine snowstorm, here Joshua calls on the great Jehovah to hurl hailstones at the enemy army and even to stop the sun so that the day would be lengthened and give the Israelites time to mop up the Canaanite army. Martin imagines Gibeon here, the Canaanite city at the upper right, as a stupendous complex of domed and colonnaded buildings. The actual Gibeon was a Bronze Age fortress made of mud brick, but Martin makes it a glorious capital city like his Babylon. If it doesn't resemble the real thing, it does resemble something else, however, and that's the architectural fantasies of this artist, Joseph Gandy, a neglected English painter and architect who made renderings for the great architect John Soane. At the bottom you can see a project by Soane for a triumphal bridge, and at the top an idea of Gandy's own invention, the Palace of Satan in the Epic of Milton, Paradise Lost, which Milton named Pandemonium. Martin elaborated it for his view of Gibeon. And Martin used his visionary architecture lavishly from now on, as you saw in Belshazzar's Feast. And in the process, he carries on a tradition of imagining building schemes with a utopian flavor that arose during the time of the Revolution in France. For example, these dream schemes by Boulez at the upper left, a library for France, at the bottom, a museum and a hall of fame, and at the upper right, by his contemporary Ledoux, of a cemetery in an ideal city. All buildings of stupendous scale, geometric perfection, and engineering impossibility. The writing on the wall predicted Belshazzar's death and the loss of his empire to the Medes and the Persians, as you heard. But we don't actually see this happen. Martin took the next great step in his career and actually pictured destruction on a scale nobody had ever seen pictured. These are the paintings that Martin is the best known for nowadays. Many of Martin's audience had seen paintings like the one on the left here of recent eruptions of Vesuvius, painted by Joseph Wright of Derby, who's a generation older than Martin, who made it wondrous and scary. And there were paintings of the historic eruption of 79 AD that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum, and what it might have been like for its hopeless victims, like the one by Pierre-Henri de Valenciennes on the screen. In 1822, Martin painted the whole ancient disaster according to the eyewitness account of Pliny the Younger. To see Martin's new picture, you went not to the Royal Academy or to the British Institution, but you went along Piccadilly to the Egyptian Hall. This was a commercial showplace in Piccadilly with quite a variety of attractions, high and low. A couple of years earlier, for 1 shilling, you could have seen Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, fresh from its debut at the Salon in Paris, or in front of a scenic backdrop a couple of years later, you could have seen a family of Laplanders from Norway who'd brought a reindeer with them so that your child could have a sleigh ride, kind of a short sleigh ride. Martin's painting aimed for the gut. You get the gorgeous horror of the eruption, the sky going dark, the sun hiding behind the blood-red clouds, huge waves wrecking the Roman fleet. It's also full of poignant details. The crowds of refugees struggling up to higher ground, soldiers trying to shield their wives and children from the hot ash. To the right of center, partway back, is the naval commander and great naturalist, Pliny the Elder. It was his nephew, Pliny the Younger, who wrote that his uncle had sailed into the bay to observe the spectacle and landed near Stabiae, where he was overcome with poison gas from the mountain and died. And Martin shows him collapsing in the arms of his friend Pomponianus. Martin's formula is familiar from Belshazzar's Feast, a gripping drama, great exactness in rendering things and people that his audience has heard about, but like Martin himself, have never seen. With Pompeii, it's a spectacle caused not by God, but by nature, death-dealing, uncontrollable. And as popular entertainment, it was irresistible. Some 50,000 people saw it at Egyptian Hall, so the claim went anyway, and it got good reviews in the press. I'll just quote one. "It is a powerful address to the imagination and upon a subject which enabled the artist to indulge the full latitude of his conceptions. The horror of the scene is much increased by the destruction of shipping and the receding and agitation of the sea. The total helplessness of man is shown in various ineffectual efforts by human beings, vainly endeavoring to escape from the general calamity." Mr. Martin has adhered to the historian's record of the catastrophe, which realized all the horror which the most vivid fancy could paint. In short, Martin was getting credit for being both horrifying and correct. A dozen years later, Martin's friend, Bulwer Lytton, brought out his novel The Last Days of Pompeii, and his heroine Nydia, displaced Martin's picture as the defining popular image of the event, thanks to this, mainly to this marble sculpture based on the book, carved by Randolph Rogers. This is Nydia, the blind slave girl, who fortunately had excellent hearing, who led others through the darkness to safety. From around the time of the destruction of Pompeii, for about 12 years, Martin was occupied with other projects, including printmaking. He became so expert at the technique of mezzotint that he contracted to produce 24 illustrations to Paradise Lost, and another set in smaller format. He then began to keep the profits himself by doing the printing at home. He published print versions of his most popular paintings, and he launched a series of large prints illustrating the Bible, mostly original compositions or else reworkings of earlier ones. The emphasis, I have to say, was on catastrophe, and this became Martin's stock in trade, divine retribution for human sin in all its forms. Having become wealthy from the sale of paintings and prints, Martin spent a lot of his time during the next 10 years designing civil engineering projects. He proposed a sewer system and a water purification project for London at the top. Sewage sludge would be collected and sent out of town for fertilizer. He also proposed a railroad around the city, linking its major attractions. London's population tripled in Martin's lifetime, making for dire conditions of housing and sanitation for a great many people. And Martin's schemes, which he proposed to be privately funded, would have improved lives without doubt, but Parliament refused to go along, and they came to nothing. Before we turn back to Belshazzar's Feast, I need to show you the most ambitious works of Martin's career, which take us to the end of his life. Each of these trios of paintings has a stupendous image of destruction at its center. This one you know, it's across the street at the British Art Center. It deals with the flood in Genesis, beginning with the deluge itself. This version of the scene is dated 1834, which comes very close, we think, to the original of 1826. That's been lost. You see in the picture that Martin doesn't just show rising waters, he shows a great storm, an earthquake, in which nothing is stable any longer. People are forced out onto this tilted shelf of rock. Some in the foreground are trying to climb up, while in the distance, great crowds on the edge are about to be engulfed by this sort of tsunami that's rolling towards them. The sun is almost blotted out, but it lights the ark, tiny, tiny, which is perched up on a ledge just under it. And the moon lights up the collapse of the mountain itself, which will fall in just a moment. The painting is hard to describe, hard to decipher on the screen, and even harder is it sometimes in the original. Fortunately, we have help from Martin's large engraving of 1828, which lets us see, among other things, the cave at the right, where people have fled to shelter, and the enormous crowds in the far, far distance awaiting their doom. This painting actually got no particular notice at the Royal Academy and went unsold. It was sent to France and was shown in the Salon of 1835, where it earned a gold medal and quite a lot of good press, and some not so good. The critic, Théophile Gautier, described a unanimous chorus of praise from visitors. One person, he said, crying out, "Ooh, ah, what admirable talent, biblical talent, apocalyptic," etc., etc. Gautier admired Martin's prints, but until now, he said, he hadn't seen his paintings, and he gave his opinion of the deluge, that it was fabulously bad. All that cataclysm and crowd scene was something new in images of the deluge. I have to point out that these go back to the Italian Renaissance, including Michelangelo, and almost invariably they use a few figures or a family group to express the pathos of approaching death for every single person on earth, the innocent as well as the sinners. This is Nicolas Poussin. He does this in his famous picture of 1664. And so does Turner, who supplies more of everything, more figures, more rain, more wind and rising waters, but nothing in comparison to Martin's epic image of nature run amok. Later, Martin added two companion pieces to the deluge. One is titled The Eve of the Deluge, painted for Prince Albert, where prophets gather here on a little bluff and foretell the coming punishment of mankind. The other one is called The Assuaging of the Waters, now in the San Francisco Museum. The view is from the top of Mount Ararat, the top, which is almost covered by water that we have to imagine has risen thousands and thousands of feet. And there is a white dove collecting the olive branch that he will deliver to the ark out there somewhere on the gradually receding ocean. One last catastrophe. Literally the last one. This is the end of the world. Martin makes a picture from the words of Revelation of St. John about what is called the great day of his wrath, the title of the picture. When the sixth seal is opened and there's an earthquake, and the sun turns black and the moon turns red, and every mountain island is dislodged, and all the powerful of the earth hide in caves. It's a vision of disorder that's literal and maniacally exact in all of its details. In Martin's customary pamphlet, he says that the great and leading feature of these productions is that they tend to inspire religious feeling and inculcate the desire to live morally and do good. Church groups and school groups were brought to this show to be edified. Like the deluge, this one had a before and an after, the Last Judgment here above, and the plains of heaven below. All three finished by 1853 and went on tour along with the customary pamphlet, Glasgow and Edinburgh first, then a long tour of provincial cities, thanks to the railroads, which had greatly extended their network in the past 10 years. It was reported that after 2 years of travel, pictures by Martin had had more than 2 million visitors, and then the tour went on to more cities that had bid for the privilege. In 1857, they came to New York, accompanied by great bundles of printed reproductions. At least one sophisticated critic saw something a little comic in the whole pay-per-view arrangement, as well as manipulative, perhaps, in the paintings themselves. This item appeared in Harper's Monthly. The drollery is indescribable, of mounting 2 flights of stairs and gradually, through the darkening gloom of thick baize wall hangings, approaching the penetralia of mysteries. Thick green baize with a large picture on each of its 3 sides, and on the 4th, a pensive clerk to take your little name for your little subscription. The gas is pouring all its effulgence upon the pictures. In all of these pictures there is a certain kind of power, but it is still a false force, like that of rhetoric. They are sure to make the foolish stare, but they are all barbarous and savage performances after all. By 1861, it was said that 8 million people had seen these pictures. And even accounting some exaggeration in, this must have been the most successful traveling exhibition of contemporary art ever. This enthusiastic response was not simply a result of publicity, it came from popular beliefs and an opportunistic play on them. The Last Judgment scene, for example, shows contemporary people, among those here on the left, those being judged. The lineup of the saved here includes well-behaved historical figures, many of them British, and among the damned on the right at the bottom, conspicuously is a king and a pope. There are other topical details there, like a railroad train in the background that's going off a cliff. The message is that the present-day vices of false belief and materialism are about to be punished. A lot of radical preachers and laymen believed fervently in what has been called millennialism, that there's a pattern, as told in the book of Revelation, that greed and corruption builds up in 1,000-year cycles, and that the kingdom of God on earth would certainly come to an end. There isn't any evidence that Martin himself was waiting for the apocalypse, but the expectations had trickled down to a great many of his public, and Martin and his promoters knew that very well and played to it. 150 years later, we're so accustomed to apocalyptic visions served up with special effects, like those of Roland Emmerich in the movie of 4 years ago, that it's hard to imagine the thrill for Martin's audience of a huge, vivid image of the world coming to an end before its eyes. I'd like to return from the end of the world to 7th century Mesopotamia and ask, how did Martin come to this subject and his grandiose treatment of it? But first ask, how common a subject has Belshazzar's feast been in the history of art? The answer is not very common. There's this one of 1635 by Rembrandt, a picture that was in England by Martin's time in the collection of the Earl of Derby, and it's likely that Martin knew it, either in the original or in a mezzotint that his brother had made. But the whole idea is different. This one is about the king's reaction, rising, turning in amazement. He's been at the table feasting off the temple treasure, which Rembrandt imagines as the swankiest kind of contemporary Dutch silver. He overturns the vessels with one arm and fends off the vision with another. It's cropped in tight, and there's no prophet Daniel there to foretell his doom, just the guilty potentate and the blazing letters that spell out his fate. The other treatments that Martin knew were by contemporaries of his, the American painters Benjamin West and Washington Allston. West's painting is at the top. You'll remember, if you were here 3 lectures ago, that West emigrated from Pennsylvania and was court painter to George III and one of the most famous artists alive. Allston at the bottom was a friend of Martin's from Boston and trained at the Royal Academy under West. West shows the baffled scholars at the right with their scrolls, the shocked king and his courtiers, and the venerable prophet whose broad gesture connects the words on the wall and the king. The setting is confined, and the fact that it's a banquet is just merely signaled by the presence of silver in the background. Allston pretty much takes over West's composition, adding a queen and more bystanders, a more mysterious lighting scheme, and nice touches like the one on the far left, the snuffed out flame of the menorah-like candelabrum behind the doomed king. So Martin takes the elements of these neoclassical stagings and he kind of pushes them apart. Your eye has to travel around the picture to take them in and work out the relationships for yourself. More important is the conception of the setting. For Rembrandt and West and Alston, the event was indoors, almost intimate, in the palace, but focused on Belshazzar's state of mind as an emblem of his downfall. Martin puts the actors out into a public space, into an extravagant space that expresses the very height of material ambition. Let me just say a few things about the image of Babylon. You've already seen that fantasies of classical architecture by Soane and Gandhi that fed Martin's imagination. But when it came to actually picturing Babylon, Martin didn't have much to go on besides earlier prints, much earlier, which were all based on descriptions by Herodotus and other ancient writers, like this one at the bottom on the left, designed by Martin van Heemskerk in the 16th century, and the other one at the right at the top, this that kind of ambitious double-page spread by the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher, both artists making much of the building here, the Etemanki ziggurat that inspired the biblical legend of the Tower of Babel. Travelers to Mesopotamia were beginning to find the actual sites mentioned in the Bible, which was a great quest all through the 19th century. And Martin's contemporary, the adventurer Claudius J. Rich, had just published an account of his stay in Babylon and his attempt to identify the impressive mounds that he saw on the Euphrates, to identify them with the texts of the Old Testament. Archaeologists get excited by mounds, but as you see, there wasn't any architecture standing that could inspire Martin's picture. And then there are the crowds in Martin's painting, and in many other paintings and mezzotints, sheer numbers of the saved and the damned, of Pompeians and Assyrians, nameless victims of the deluge. These crowds were, you could say, crowd-pleasing. They helped make Martin's name and to build his audience, and they put him in sync with another popular phenomenon in England at the time. I mean concerts with immense orchestras and choruses, which after the middle of the century were given in new halls built expressly to contain many thousands of listeners, including the increasing number of middle and lower class ticket buyers who were attracted to such spectacles as oratorios by Handel, often on biblical themes, rearranged for huge forces. This is the famous Crystal Palace, the greenhouse-like exhibition building that was so successful in 1851 that it was moved to the suburbs a couple of years later. And this is where, somewhat later, the annual Handel Festival might have an orchestra with 500 musicians and a choir of several thousand voices. As the newspaper cliche had it, this was heaven on earth. The same rich industrial cities of the north, like Liverpool, whose citizens turned out by the thousands to see the latest paintings by John Martin when they were toured to town, these citizens built new concert halls of unprecedented size, like St. George's Hall in Liverpool, a building worthy of even of Martin's imagination. The climax of this development of John Martinish gigantism is the Royal Albert Hall, opened in 1871 by Prince Albert's widow, Queen Victoria, a kind of indoor coliseum with seats for 5,000 plus. And here's where the inspiration for Albert Hall came from, I'm quite sure, and that is, down at the bottom, Martin's amazing image of Satan on his throne in a hall with curving terraces and what look like box seats. A prom concert at the Royal Albert Hall is the closest you can get probably to being in one of John Martin's pictures, specifically John Martin's Hell. Getting back to Babylon, Martin shifts the emphasis from the private drama of Belshazzar, as I said, to a public one. He shows Babylon in all its vast extent, or the palace anyway, in its vast extent and dizzy heights. We know it's about to be sacked, and many in the terrified crowds in the picture, including Belshazzar himself, will be killed. It's also a drama of pride punished and also virtue rewarded, since the captive Jews, including their prophet Daniel, will be liberated. And the turbulent sky with the conjunction of moon and star adds an element of the cosmic to a drama that Martin portrays as religious and political. The moral of the piece is what God announces here in bright lights, and Daniel reveals that there is divine justice, that it's about to bring down a proud, sinful monarch. It's been suggested that John Martin might have been commenting on the contemporary Hanoverian kings George III and George IV. There's no direct evidence of this, and neither Martin nor his reviewers ever put a word in print that would draw a parallel. But I think the suggestion is there by way of warning, and I think at least some of the audience got it. George III had been king for almost 60 years when he died in 1820, the year that Martin painted Belshazzar's feast. This is the amazing, wonderful, informal portrait that was in the great Zoffany exhibition at the British Art Center a couple of years ago. In later life, George III, after losing his American colonies, had 2 bouts of madness and went blind. You may have seen his life dramatized by Alan Bennett in the movie of 1994 with Nigel Hawthorne. He had stepped down in 1811 and turned over his official duties to his dissolute son, the Prince of Wales, who became Prince Regent and went on being a conspicuously adulterous, spendthrift playboy. And he was bitterly criticized for it. One zealous Scottish preacher, the Reverend Neil Douglas, was put on trial for sedition in 1817 for likening George III to Nebuchadnezzar for his infidelity and corruption, and comparing the Prince Regent to his son Belshazzar. The case was reported in print, and even though Douglas was acquitted, that trial must have had what we'd call a chilling effect, making Martin and his reviewers wary of pointing out the obvious about his picture. That is that the Prince Regent had been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Nebuchadnezzar, you'll remember, had sacked the Temple of Jerusalem and brought the sacred temple vessels back to Babylon, together with his Israelite slaves. Here he is, this is Nebuchadnezzar, at the Metropolitan Opera a couple of years ago, under the Italian name Nabucco, in Verdi's wonderful opera of 1842. Right after Nabucco sings, "I am king no longer, I am God," he starts to go mad. For his sins, Nebuchadnezzar was sent terrible dreams, according to the Old Testament. And worse than that, in popular versions of his life, Nebuchadnezzar went insane and lived like an animal in the wilderness. I'm just showing you William Blake's amazing image of the king turned into a beast on all fours. In this engraving of 1815, here the great cartoonist Cruikshank, a relentless critic of the royal family, made the Prince Regent into a frightening little Nebuchadnezzar tormented by horrible dreams of responsibility and debt and misrule. I think that Martin's setting for the Babylonian court, his vast enclosure, his pavilions and colonnades, would have reinforced an association with the Prince Regent, who had his own high ambition for public buildings. Starting in 1809, the Prince Regent monopolized the great architect and planner John Nash for 20 years in a series of projects that gave London its Regency face. Most of them are still there, serving their purpose of being both grand and functional. There were building going on everywhere in the 1820s, and the Prince Regent's appetite for architectural glory was there in the face of Londoners wherever they turned, year after year. A case in point, when the Prince Regent moved to Buckingham Palace at vast expense, he'd raised the money by tearing down Carlton House, where he'd been living, and having Nash replace it with Carlton House Terrace, a spec development of very expensive row houses meant for very grand buyers. There it is on the left. Coming 7 years after Belshazzar's feast and finished a couple of years after George's death, its heavy Doric colonnade below and setback gallery above, I would think, looked for a long time like a kind of British Babylon, ordered by an unrepentant spendthrift king who was still heedless of the handwriting on the wall. In the former colonies of George III, the painter Thomas Cole hoped to persuade Americans to commission history paintings on the model of John Martin. Cole knew Martin's paintings and prints from several trips back to his native England. It was Martin's example, more than anything, that inspired Cole's five-part allegory on the rise and fall of empire. Here, the destruction of an imaginary ancient capital. Cole admired both the didactic purposes of Martin's art and its grandiose vision of the doomed glories of long-dead civilizations. Whatever topical messages it may have carried in the 1820s about misrule and the wages of sin, Martin's picture has survived into our time. So what are we to make of it? I'm not going to suggest that it has any particular moral for our era that isn't there in the story of the book of Daniel. But Martin's vision of Babylon has had a long life into my grandparents' and my parents' time, and even into my own. I'll close this talk with a few examples. My grandfather could have gone to Babylon in Oakland Gardens, a summer amusement park in Roxbury, part of Boston. Roxbury, you remember, is where John Trumbull watched the Battle of Bunker Hill, or tried to. In the 1880s, the proprietors had built a reconstruction of Babylon based on John Martin's prints, with seats for 10,000 people to watch what the poster proclaims to be battles, pageants, songs and dances, elephants, camels, and so forth, put on by the firm of Barnum and Bailey. And they had a Pompeii on the site too. But it wasn't enough to make a profit for more than about 12 seasons, and then it's disappeared, and disappeared without a trace. My father, as a boy, saw the long epic film Intolerance by D.W. Griffith, whose Babylon had supplied the most impressive images that had ever been seen on the screen. Griffith had had this set built on a dirt road in Hollywood that was later paved and named Sunset Boulevard. Martin's colonnades was evidently a bit tame for Griffith, so he added some inventions of his own, like the columns with rearing elephants on top. And since Martin's crowds might have seemed a little skimpy, he hired 4,000 extras to play priests and slaves and temple maidens and court eunuchs and Assyrian troops. And now I can drive east on Sunset Boulevard from my house to the place where the set once was. There's a mall on the site with D.W. Griffiths-ish Babylonian decor. It's a reconstruction of a reconstruction of a reconstruction. And I can have a margarita where Belshazzar drank wine from the sacred vessels. The next lecture, and next to last, will be about another famous scene by another celebrity painter, set in another ancient place, a Roman amphitheater, in another imaginative reconstruction. The narrative will be implied, not spelled out. The movies will seem even closer, as the role of history painting will have changed in the 19th century as it adapted to new audience and as it shrank. Please join us if you can. Thank you.